I'm Jim Tech. You're watching Now Media. With me, John Carpe. Welcome back to the show. We're going to talk about the bank records, the TD Bank records, the RCMP records for the Evan Blackman case. And that is the judge has ordered those records, and that's to do with the Freedom Convoy.
Evan Blackman was arrested and charged with mischief and obstructing police. That happened in February, actually, in the middle. He wasn't part of the Freedom Convoy during the 3 weeks, but when Trudeau illegally invoked the Emergencies Act and police began using violence against the peaceful protesters, Evan Blackman went to Ottawa, and he was actually acquitted at trial. The Crown had very weak evidence suggesting he had done anything wrong. There was a video from a drone without audio showing him kneeling on the ground and putting his hands up in the air, taking off his hat, putting his hand on his chest, singing "O Canada," encouraging the protesters to not obstruct police, etc. Unfortunately, the Crown appealed that and a new trial was ordered. And so what the Justice Centre is doing in this case is if he is convicted on the second trial, we are going to ask that the proceedings against him be stayed or discontinued because his bank account was frozen, and that was an unjustified violation of his charter freedoms, and so that warrants a stay of proceedings against Evan Blackman.
Yeah, so the judge has ordered those records from the TD Bank and the RCMP so they can have a look at that and see what justification they had to do that. And do you get to see any of that as well, or?
Unfortunately, not initially, maybe later on, but initially the judge has ordered that those documents be given to him and to him alone so that he can look them over and decide whether they are relevant or not to our application for a stay of proceedings.
Doesn't it seem odd, though? Wouldn't you think that those, if they had that justification, why wouldn't that be at least disclosed to the accused?
Well, this is not directly about the guilt or innocence of the accused. This is more on the issue of what is the appropriate penalty. So these records pertaining to the freezing of Evan Blackman's bank account, those records don't pertain directly to whether he was guilty or innocent of a crime when he was in Ottawa taking part in the peaceful protest. So in that sense, he doesn't have that automatic right to the documents that he would have if they were relevant to his defense. But this is more of a separate, it's related, but it's a separate application.
Right. It's kind of the same scenario kind of thing that kind of has some side issues to it. How many Canadians had there? Do you have that number? How many Canadians had their bank accounts frozen by the government?
It was between 200 and 300 Canadians had their bank accounts frozen.
The one that
doesn't include...
Yeah, no, go ahead. That doesn't include?
No, that doesn't include some... I was talking to a friend just recently. His bank account was not frozen, but he had trouble dealing with his account because there's so many people were going to the bank to withdraw cash that the whole banking system started to verge into a crisis of sorts.
Yeah, I know some local people that had the same thing. They went to get their money out, and the bank gave them nothing but gears on how to get their money out, and it said they can only take this much out, and they were just like even got more worried at that point. And I remember the one high-profile case that was that bakery on the island there that had her bank account frozen because she'd made a donation to the Freedom Convoy.
Well, it's just an absolute disgrace. We turned into a banana republic with polar bears. You know, we Canadians used to look down on third world regimes and repressive dictatorships where in some countries it's normal if you criticize the prime minister or the president, next day you're suddenly facing charges for murder or rape or fraud or something, and you're locked up in jail. And everybody knows it's because you criticize the prime minister, because they don't have those checks and balances in place with the rule of law, where the Crown is impartial, or the prosecuting office might not be the Crown if it's not a monarchy, but the rule of law applying to the prosecutor, where crimes are only prosecuted when there's strong evidence and reasonable likelihood of conviction. All of that just went out the window in Canada, where without any due process, hundreds of people had their bank accounts frozen, and none of these people had an opportunity to defend themselves or to say, excuse me, I'm not guilty of any crime. These were not people that were funding a designated terrorist organization, because there are laws on the books that should be enforced, that are good laws to prevent terrorism from being financed. This is the Prime Minister personally dislikes a peaceful protest in Ottawa, and then just issues an order that, and shame on the banks for complying so readily. They could have put up a fuss and pushed back a little bit.
Yeah, I liken it back to the old King days, where they used to put a couple of guys' heads on sticks out at the front gate there to warn people, because that bakery and the media, the government-funded media, wasted no time to trumpet that case out there to make sure other Canadians were well aware of what could happen if they were funding that. And then there were stories, I think Rosemary Barton pushed out there, that saying that like Russians were involved and all kinds of things, without any proof of any of that stuff. And they obviously that fired up Canadians to say, we got to stop this. This is terrorists. This is Russians. This is all these things. And turns out after they did all this stuff that it was just a bunch of Canadians donating $250 or less to this freedom convoy.
Well, it was a dark day in the history of Canada, and it's or dark days, plural. Fortunately, we do have a court ruling on the books issued in January 2024 by the federal court. It's one of the cases that the Justice Centre was very heavily involved with, and the court ruled that Trudeau acted illegally when declaring a national emergency, and that a peaceful protest in Ottawa, which at the time when the Emergencies Act was invoked, that was the only outstanding protest that was still in operation. The situations in Coutts, Alberta, and Windsor, Ontario, had been fully resolved. So the court ruled that there was no national emergency, and the federal government acted illegally, and that the freezing of bank accounts was unreasonable search and seizure, and the charter rights of people were violated. So it's good that we did push back, but it still remains sad that this happened in the first place. Using violence to crack down on a peaceful protest, and then freezing bank accounts. Again, it's the type of thing that 5 years ago Canadians would only have imagined could happen in a banana republic or some repressive regime. And here it was happening in our very own supposedly first world country, supposedly free and democratic society, supposedly a place where the rule of law is in place. So very dark times, and I hope that Canadians have learned from it.
Are any of the banks facing consequences, or the RCMP themselves? Are any civil cases out there that people are going after either one of those institutions for what they did?
I'm aware of some civil actions having been filed against the banks. Now, the government's emergency orders expressly exempted the banks from liability for anything that they did. So that's a hurdle that those court actions will have to overcome. However, that very order itself, the order exempting banks from civil liability, that order that itself could also be challenged as unconstitutional. So if that is struck down, you've got clearing the way for Canadians getting some compensation. It might not be large amounts. It might only be several $100 or $1,000 or $2,000 for mental anguish and mental distress. It might not be big, but it would be great if the banks were held to account, because they could have pushed back. They have big legal departments. They have lawyers on staff. The lawyers could have looked at the government's orders and said, we don't think these are constitutional. We don't think these are warranted. they could have pushed back, and they didn't. When the government said jump, the banks asked how high.
Yeah, I guess maybe if we got to look at the TD Bank and the RCMP records, you could see if there was any false intel in there as well to kind of like justify these actions. But until they make those public, that's pretty tough, right?
Yeah, yeah.
There's another high-profile case going on right now. Tomorrow, there's a sentencing for Chris Barber. Any light you can shed on that?
Yeah, so the hearing is going to be taking place on Wednesday the 23rd, Thursday the 24th. And so the Crown is arguing that Chris Barber and Tamara Leach should each have to spend 7 years in jail over their participation and leadership role in the Freedom Convoy. Plus, they're asking for an additional 1 year in jail for Chris Barber for allegedly inciting other people to disobey a court order. The decision is going to be not released this week, but it could be next week. It could be in August. And Chris Barber's lawyer, which is being funded by the Justice Center, so there's donations from people to the Justice Center. The Justice Center is paying for Chris Barber's legal defense. And she will be arguing, among other things, that he was extremely compliant with police and the Ottawa Mayor's office and the provincial government, all the authorities. Chris Barber, he parked his truck where he was directed to park it. When he was asked to move his truck, he moved it and went away from that area. He was in touch with the police. So both Chris Barber and Tamara Leach tried consistently throughout to be cooperative with the police and listening to police and following police instructions. That was the whole nature of the protest. So even though there was somehow there was a conviction, guilty, a finding that he was guilty of mischief and counseling to commit mischief, mischief in this case referring to the interfering with the lawful use and enjoyment of property by the downtown residents of Ottawa. So even though there was a guilt finding, I think we've got very strong arguments for leniency, and this is a man who does not deserve to spend any time in jail.
Yeah, Pierre Poilievre waded into this. I think they put out a statement there, I think yesterday, on how this seems to be a travesty of justice when we see many other criminals going free and on like more violent crimes, and then a lot of Canadians really have a tough time. It seemed absurd that these charges are mischief, right? Some people even say it's basically noise violations and parking violations, and obviously they're the leaders of the noise violations and parking violations, and it just seems absurd to many Canadians.
It's this is a very sad development in our country that you have this breakdown in the rule of law when you get prosecuted differently depending on what your politics are. We saw crime committed in broad daylight in Winnipeg, Manitoba in July of 2021 when a bunch of protesters vandalized a statue of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was the reigning monarch when the residential schools for Aboriginals were started up as kind of a government policy. And so this was right after the thus far unproven claim that there's 215 children buried in Kamloops, for which no compelling evidence has been presented at all. But after that, there's this big wave of anger and protests and so on. So these protesters tore down and vandalized a statue of Queen Victoria at the Manitoba Legislature grounds. Police stood there watching, and Crown prosecutors announced they were not prosecuting what was clearly and obviously a crime committed in broad daylight. But there's the politics comes into it. These were people presumably that were upset with Queen Victoria over the residential schools. So they had the correct, being facetious here, but they had the correct cause that they were demonstrating for, so they were allowed to break the law. But you got, Chris Barber and Tamara Leach and other people in Ottawa are protesting peacefully. They're not destroying any property, unlike these Manitoba folks, and yet they're criminally charged.
Yeah, I mean, some of the hysterical elected officials, saying this was an overthrow of the government. I mean, that was just hysterical nonsense. And then again, will the judge take into account the overreach from the government? That's already been proven that it was overreach with the overuse of the Emergencies Act. Like, the whole situation seems to be completely an overreaction by the government. And then, we can be an armchair quarterback and say Justin Trudeau just would have went outside and talked to them. Maybe all of this never would have happened.
Well, I think you're right there. I mean, he could have very easily, and without any risk to himself, he could have, put the word out. He wanted to talk with 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever number, and they could have gone into the Prime Minister's office and gone through the metal detector first, et cetera, et cetera. He could have sat down with these people very easily. In terms of your question about the impact of the federal court ruling that the federal government acted illegally when declaring a national emergency, my understanding is it does not have a direct impact on the criminal trial, because the criminal question is, did Chris Barber, did Tamara Leach, are they guilty of mischief? And if so, what should the penalty be? And so even though there is a court ruling now on the books that the government acted illegally in declaring a national emergency and using violence to crack down on peaceful protest, I don't think that's going to have a direct impact on the sentencing of Chris Barber and Tamara Leach, which again is being argued in court in Ottawa this week.
How does the judge, obviously they're using a legal basis to do this, though, when they look at this, none of these are violent crimes, right? These are, mischief and stuff like that. And then, you look at some of the violence that is kind of often ignored, or they get lenient sentences in that. And how do they square that circle? Like, how do they come around to it and say, like, the sentence for this is this? Is it the head on the stick that they're trying to make that point that you don't never go up against the government, or how do you square this?
Well, we'll have to wait and see what the judge rules and what the rationale would be. And it would not be surprising if that this is the court of first instance, right? This is the trial judge, and sentence imposed after conviction after trial. So this could be appealed by the Crown if the Crown feels it's too lenient. And in the same way, Chris Barber and Tamara Leach can instruct their lawyers to appeal the finding of guilt, as well as appealing the severity of the sentence if they can appeal the one, the other, or both.
Yeah. How much time did both Tamara and Chris serve already? Like, they were held in custody. Tamara spent a grand total of 49 days in jail, and it was horrific. I mean, they flew out people from the serious, I forget the name of it, but the serious crime, the homicide unit. Okay, so there was inspectors or detectives from the homicide unit. These people are supposedly busy trying to solve murders and find the murderers, flew across the country to arrest Tamara Leach in Alberta and put her into chains and handcuff her. And, Tamara is a very reasonable and law-abiding, law-respecting person. They could have phoned her and said, hey, report to a department.
Yeah, we want you to come to Ottawa, and she would have said, okay, well, when do you want me to be there? And she would have, gotten on a plane and flown to Ottawa on her own. But they flew these law enforcement across the country to arrest Tamara Leach on an alleged breach of bail conditions. But I mean, there are people walking out on bail that are charged with murder, charged with sexual assault, charged with aggravated assaults, or seriously causing serious harm to people. They are let out on bail. Many of them quite easily, quite readily. And here we have Tamara Leach charged with mischief, and she got locked up again for allegedly breaching her bail conditions. Just fanatical the way that these Ontario prosecutors have gone after Tamara Leach and Chris Barber.
And did Chris serve any time as well? Was he in custody for a period of time?
Just, I think it was several hours or a day and a half when he was initially arrested. I think he spent about roughly a day in jail, and thereafter, I don't think he had to spend any other time in jail.
So this excessive show of force by the police forces here in Canada, that again sounds like another political message, no different than the King days when they would actually make a great example out of somebody, because it does sound like an excessive use of force or of departments to arrest somebody that is nonviolent as well.
Well, the Crown prosecutors in Ontario routinely claim that they are underfunded and they don't have the resources to bring murderers and rapists and serious criminals to justice. That's what they say. And yet the amount of time, effort, energy that the Crown prosecutors in Ontario have devoted to prosecuting Tamara Leach and Chris Barber has been astronomical in terms of resources used. I mean, this trial went on for weeks and weeks, spread over a period of the better part of a year, that they are just putting a ton of evidence about the protest before the courts in Ottawa. A lot of resources used on that. And again, there are people accused of murder and rape that are not being brought to justice in Ontario.
Does she have any civil case there for that excessive use of force, or FOIs for seeing the emails to get, that the high-end police officers come and make that high-profile arrest? Is there anything there?
I don't know what plans Chris or Tamara might have for civil action in the future. I think I suspect their focus right now is just getting through these criminal matters first. There is a $290 million lawsuit commenced by Ottawa bureaucrat Zexi Lee against Tamara Leach and Chris Barber and a whole bunch of other individuals. And they're claiming that their loss of sleep for a few nights because of the late night horn honking, that they're entitled to $290 million in damages, which of course is absurd. But there are millions of dollars in court bank accounts in escrow where these were donations that were seized by the Ontario, I forget which level of government. There's money sitting in court, and so I think
that's still sitting. That has not been returned to the donors yet.
That's my understanding. We've got $5 or $6 million that is kind of sitting there. And so we got this civil lawsuit where Zexi Lee and other people are trying to start this class action and get their hands on the money that's there, saying that they suffered damages because of the horn honking at night.
Maybe they should pull the old shotgun clause in and actually do a $290 million lawsuit for the excessive use of force against the people that were peacefully protesting, because they've already laid out the number. Yeah, it's kind of like it's comedy at best, right? But
well, I would certainly hope that that people are suing the police. If they were injured and harmed by police brutality, especially with the court ruling in place now that the government acted illegally. That's got to, I'm sure, have some impact on a civil lawsuit as well.
Do you think that fundraising that happened for the Freedom Convoy, do you think that was part of the embarrassment for the government, that so many Canadians had contributed that much money in that short period of time, that it was to them a threat to their stability of power? And there was I don't think there was an insurrection or anything like that some of the people would say, but it did definitely create a movement that would say that they wanted an election or something.
Well, I think the government was quite spooked to see that this movement had a lot of support. I think the movement. I think the Freedom Convoy made it clear to a lot of Canadians who have been personally, quietly, in isolation, individually, they had been against the lockdown measures and saw through the false media narrative. The government-funded media was making COVID out to be much worse than what it actually was. But the people who saw through the false narratives were isolated from each other. And so I think what Freedom Convoy did was it made it clearer to people that they were not alone. And I think that really galvanized, I changed the whole dynamic where people were like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not the only person that's against the lockdowns, mandatory vaccination policies. I'm not the only person that's able to see through the false narrative that was put out by the government-funded media, and so created this movement and this unity. And I think that really spooked the Ottawa elites. They were insulated largely from the impact of the lockdowns because that town is populated by people that get the paycheck
Living off the government paycheck
deposited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they don't know what it's like to have your small business destroyed. They don't know what it's like to be a restaurant owner and to have legal obligations to pay rent, regardless of how many customers you get or you don't get. You got your fixed costs of rent. Most of these people in Ottawa and most politicians, they have no idea what it's like to run a business and to face that horrible psychological stress of seeing your business fail, getting forced into bankruptcy, getting forced into unemployment. They didn't get it, right? They're a town, again, there are private businesses in Ottawa as well. You have restaurants there, for example. But by and large, it's a government-funded town where people, judges, politicians, bureaucrats, they kept on getting the same paycheck throughout the lockdowns, throughout the vaccine mandates. So they were quite spooked to see a lot of grassroots Canadians showing up in Ottawa. I think they had a hard time with that psychologically, seeing that so many people were against the vaccine mandates and the lockdowns.
Yeah, and I think we did quite a few stories at the time too. We did it on the truckers that had Okanagan roots. We did many stories, and we got a lot of hate for that. We got like how we're literally killing people and doing different things by like sharing stories about like people why they're there and different things. And a lot of people were reaching out and saying that that's a fringe minority that are there. And I think Trudeau used those words too. It was a fringe minority. And then I would say to them at that time, I would say, then explain the tens of thousands that line the ditches as the Freedom Convoy rolled into Ottawa. Explain that to me. And then maybe I'll understand it better, because it does not look like a fringe to me. They were on the overpasses, they were lining ditches. And it was, and then obviously the fundraising was, like many Canadians donating small amounts, $20, $50, $200, and then, having the mainstream media push out cases like that it was Russian. And then the last point I'll make is the coverage of the Freedom Convoy was completely different from the international media to what was being portrayed to Canadians from our government-funded media. Completely different. And it just really, if you take a look at it with open eyes, you can really see the difference that was happening in the world's perception of what was happening and what the Canadian government-funded media was putting out to Canadians.
Well, it was a closed loop. The media would comment on, the mayor of Ottawa and other politicians. At one point, the media were reporting that the Freedom Convoy protesters had set fire to a building. There was a case of arson. There was never any evidence at all. It was just came out of thin air. There was an incident where somebody tried to set fire to a building. Maybe they were upset with their boyfriend or girlfriend or some breakup, whatever the situation was. There was a real incident of somebody trying to set fire to a building. Fortunately, that person got caught and the fire got stopped. The fire never went anywhere. So there was an attempt at arson. That's a fact. At no time was there any evidence whatsoever to link up that individual. And it turned out when the identity was discovered, it was an Ottawa resident who, again, was upset with a boyfriend, girlfriend, ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend was doing something stupid and horribly dangerous. And yet you had, Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, and we had Trudeau, and we had the mayor of Ottawa, and we had all these politicians talk about how Freedom Convoy included arsonists and that this arson attempt was caused by the truckers. Zero evidence. And then the media, it would go around in a circle, and the media would quote the politicians, but the politicians would make statements based on what they heard on the news. And so it was a closed loop that just went round and round, and no love for truth there.
I've never seen the media act this way. They were actually doxing the truckers by going and getting the VIN numbers and then tracing the VIN numbers to the companies. They were actually doing the work for the government and actually helping them spread this message of hate and resentment towards these people, instead of digging in and saying, why are you here? That's what we were doing. We were saying, why are you here? Why are you protesting? What's so important here? And, and then again, explain the tens of thousands that line the ditches across Canada. And if the mainstream media that gets government money is the voice of Canadians, why didn't they represent Canadians? That's I think a big question to be asking. And Bill C-18 continues to suppress the free and independent press here in Canada. And until we get our free and independent media here in Canada, stories like this, there's room for stuff like this to kind of grow and fester.
Well, fortunately, they are slowly dying. It's a well-deserved death. The lack of integrity that I saw, I've always seen some bias, and a certain amount of bias is inevitable because we're all human. We all have biases, so you're never going to get,
for sure,
even unless you're being interviewed by a computer, but then there'd be the bias of the programmer that had programmed the computer. So there, bias is one thing, but when lockdowns were introduced in March of 2020, we saw the government-funded media just repeated verbatim. Everything the politicians said was repeated by the media as absolute truth, and there was no independent journalism of just being skeptical and saying, what about this, what about that? I think the ideal journalist avoids two extremes. One is the extreme of paranoia, where you say, well, all the politicians are lying to us all the time. They're all bad. They're all out to get us. That's paranoia. That should be avoided. The other opposite error, which can be just as dangerous, is this credulous naivete where the media, government-funded media, were saying, every word that comes out of the mouth of a politician or a health bureaucrat is gospel truth, is not to be questioned. So there's a healthy medium between paranoia on the one hand to avoid and credulity, this naivete and a credulous attitude. There's a healthy medium where you don't assume that the politicians are lying, but you also don't assume that everything they're saying is absolutely correct and factual. And you investigate and you ask questions. And we saw none of that for years. The media were the paid propagandists of the government narrative, and it was an absolute disgrace.
Yeah, the main function of media is to hold power to account. And the question that is always should be asked, if the government says do this, the question from media should be why? Why should we do that? And what's the ramifications of doing that? And that's the simple question, right? And if it's science, trust the science, then science is to be questioned. I mean, that's the simple truth of it, right? That is science. Question it, right? So, and that is the science of media. Question power, right? So, again,
question authority.
Yeah, and thank you, John. That's twice, or I think 3 times now you've been on here, and look forward to more times. And we look forward to seeing what happens with Tamara and Chris and Evan to see how these things play out. And thank you for the work that you do for Canadians and representing them. And we appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me on your show, and look forward to speaking again in the future.
All right, and thank you for watching Now Media.
We don't just report the news, we live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding.